Pound for pound, Ronald Reagan's Challenger address is one of the most moving pieces of rhetoric in the history of the American presidency. It is so powerful. And the way he affects that punch is just genius. It is a masterclass in public speaking. He wrote this, or he didn't write this. He had this written for him by a woman named Peggy Noonan, who was a relatively young speechwriter at the time. She has gone on to be a great writer of books, and she's a journalist. She writes for the editorials for the Wall Street Journal, I believe, right now. She's a very talented woman. But but the credit, her job is to put words in the president's mouths, and he steps up and delivers them quite extraordinarily. And it's hard to dissever the words themselves from the delivery, but we can try. As a piece of rhetoric, as a piece of language, it is an extraordinary document, just in the way that it conveys empathy. Reagan is here speaking just a few hours after the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. And it's important to recognize the history of this, where it was only a few years ago or a few years before, that the Space Shuttle program was launched. And by the time this happened in 1985, it had become a little bit blasé. People were used to it. When the first one happened, it was huge because we hadn't really engaged in the space program since the closing of the Apollo program. Here, we had this whole new technology of sending something up and bringing it back down, and it was just, it looked like a plane, it looked like a spaceship, it looked like something out of Star Trek or whatever, and this was exciting stuff. But as they kept coming up with launches every few months, it became more blasé, and people started to take it for granted. It wasn't that interesting anymore. It sometimes wouldn't even make the front page of the newspaper. It was just, another thing. Yeah, they did it. So when it happened, it was a shock. It was a great shock. And as many shocks come, it also comes layered with a certain amount of guilt. Like, we just didn't take them, we didn't give them enough consideration. We took them for granted. We got too blasé about it. And the effect was, the effect of the explosion then was somewhat twofold, because it was, yes, a shock, a national tragedy, a great loss on a abstract level, but also a very personal level, because it's like hearing that a relative of yours has passed away when you knew they were sick, and but I didn't think it was that sick, so I didn't really bother calling. But now you find, oh geez, if I had known. There's guilt involved in that. And this speech addresses that. This speech understands that. Reagan, through this speech, meets the moment of crisis in a way that few can surpass. First of all, it happened on the morning of the State of the Union address. And they postponed that immediately and said, okay, we're not doing that tonight. Instead, he gives this very short, 4.5 minute speech from the Oval Office to the nation at around 5 in the afternoon. And the setting is important. Setting counts in public speaking. He was speaking not in a raucous congressional hall packed with cheering legislators. That would have been a little tone deaf. How can you walk into, this great exaltation that happens at the beginning of every State of the Union address and then dive into something this sad and immediate. He knew to push that back. So he brought it into the Oval Office, and he kept it very simple. The Oval Office, where he speaks as the president. He's not speaking in any other setting would have been a little bit less formal. Here, he steps into the formality and says, all right, I understand my public role here. I have a public role to address the nation after a crisis or after a tragedy, so I'm going to occupy the most public space identified with that. So he's sitting behind the desk, very official. It is a sign of his public role in the office more than the individual. But he does let his humanity come through. Watch how he uses the first person in this speech. He looks, at the beginning, he does say a couple of times, I feel this, or it's my duty to inform you, and a couple of times he uses the plural, referring to himself and the First Lady, we or us. And that's fine. But as it progresses, I think he uses that on a personal level, referring to himself particularly, or him and the First Lady, or he and the First Lady, a total of 7 times. Every other time he uses we or us, he is speaking of the entire nation. He is speaking in the collective. He is putting himself within that collective and speaking for them. This is the role of, I say, a religious leader. He is, in effect, delivering a very short eulogy for the fallen. He names them all by name, each of the members of the crew who died. But he doesn't really dwell on them as individuals. We don't get, we're not going to get a full biography or obituary at this moment of those people. It's about more than them. He gives them the dignity of saying their name individually, and I'm sure this is a very conscious choice. You recognize the individual in the loss, but then he steps back a little bit and speaks of them all in a collective. From then on, they are always they. It is another plural pronoun. But by doing this, he is, by putting himself in the plural, by putting himself in the group, he is taking on the anxiety of the moment. He is taking on the confusion and the pain of the moment and exemplifying that to the audience, to the public. This is the role of a leader, quite frankly. This is the ceremonial role. Sometimes different presidents, different leaders have different strengths. Here he was rock star status in being able to convey empathy, in being able to convey shared humanity, a sense of commonality among all of us. And again, he's addressing us, everyone, and putting himself within it. There are two groups that he addresses in particular. First is NASA in general, the people who work at NASA. And he addresses them sort of as the people who work at NASA and not the organization itself, where he acknowledges that their pain might be more acute because they knew these people personally and they had so much emotionally invested in this in this mission. But think about what that little mention does on a couple of different levels. Number one, it acknowledges on a human level that, okay, certain people are going to be feeling this more acutely. It's just like when giving a eulogy or a funeral sermon or something like that. Whoever's giving it will acknowledge the special place of, let's say, the widow of the deceased or the children or something like that. You isolate that and you say, okay, this deserves specific mention. It also throws a little bit of an emotional protective barrier around NASA, quite frankly. In a political sense, he is still a politician. He is still a president. There is going to be he understands that there is going to be a natural tendency among the public and among lawmakers to say, well, you know, if this could happen, it could happen again, and why are we spending all this money to go do this? Why don't we just shutter the whole program and give up on space? Who really needs it? By prioritizing the NASA community, he is in effect throwing his arms around them and protecting them from attacks like that. But he's also doing something else, something on another spiritual level. He is addressing that, okay, you engineers and people at NASA, you astronauts and engineers and all of you people in Houston and Florida and every place, maybe we took you for granted just a little bit. Maybe we weren't so focused on you. But in this moment, we're going to recognize that you have more skin in the game and that this is hurting you perhaps more than the rest of us. So performing that for the nation, which again might feel a little guilty about not quite being aware of the dangers and taking it all for granted, Reagan is personalizing this and taking on more of the pain of this moment. The other group that he addresses very directly are school children. He says, you know, I know that many of you school children out there might have been watching this in school perhaps and are a little confused by what happened. And yeah, kids were still watching this in school, even if not as many as the first launch. And even if they didn't, they would have come home and, you know, it would have been wall-to-wall TV coverage, and it would have been somewhat shocking. And by addressing them particularly and personally, he takes on this fatherly tone. It's going to be okay. But by saying that, by taking care and taking note of the most vulnerable out there, the most distraught perhaps, he's bringing everybody in on it, because next to the kids are probably going to be the parents. And he knows that he's speaking not just to the children of the nation, but performing his role as the father figure for the nation, which the presidency inevitably is. He is communicating to all of those people who might be feeling a little lost themselves, even as they try and put on a brave face for their own kids. He is performing his role. It might not be every thought that's going through his head. He's swallowing an awful lot, I'm sure. But he is performing his role and using his words to have specific effects. And the effect is always focused on, in this, release and solace. Watch how he uses language. In language, you see a very simple speaking style that he was generally used to. Reagan is usually called the great communicator, often for the delivery. But if you look at the language itself that he uses, it matches the delivery. The delivery is very human and empathetic. The language itself is actually very spare, but invites the emotion. He uses very short sentences. If you go through this on the page, you will find only a few commas per any sentence. Short declarative sentences. Subject, verb, predicate. Casual, informal, and not afraid to, have a connecting phrase here or there, but really very simple layout of the language. As it builds, however, you get little flares here and there of poetry, of flowery language, just very subtly at first, where he's tossing something out. It might sound a little pretty, something a little sentimental, something a little, perhaps even, well, never quite melodramatic. But he keeps that on a slow simmer. But it builds because these little moments start to accumulate. And by doing this, he's not just expressing great emotion himself, which can have the effect of putting people off, of people pulling back and saying, well, geez, he's really being a little melodramatic. He's really making this all about himself. No. He's keeping it fairly simple and controlled and allowing the emotion of the moment to bring other people in, who maybe aren't as comfortable expressing their emotions or even feeling them, but they're coming to him because it's a quiet place right now. And he's bringing them in slowly and introducing little moments of poetry along the way and building towards the end. The end is the most famous line in this, where Peggy Noonan reaches into her, I assume she had this tucked away in the back of her brain. If not, maybe she went and she checked it against her old college anthology of English poetry or something like that, and comes up with this poem, a short lyric from the World War I era, I believe, to bring in the phrase, "They slip the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." In the original poem, that seems a bit melodramatic. It seems a bit forced. It seems like, you're kind of reaching a little high there, pal. Take it down a notch. But in this context, where he has kept it so tight for so long, well, 4 minutes, preparing along the way for the idea of poetry, the hint of flowery language. Just bring it all in his smooth, calming, welcoming way, so that it builds up to that moment and brings the audience along with it, so that they can feel that lift at the end. They can offer up from the depths of fear and confusion and anxiety that they started with. He brings them along to a place where he's got them in the palm of his hand, in the palm of his hand, and he is leading them towards the light. He's leading them towards something better, towards something more joyous, towards a vision of redemption from their own senses of perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, confusion. He brings them towards a vision of divine bliss. And whether you ascribe that to a kind of, specific religious dogma or not, it is a elevated vision at the end, and one that takes, again, from the depths of some despair and brings his audience to some place very new and hopeful, and a vision of peace. That's what this speech can do. That's what this speech does. And that's what any truly great speaker can do if they just pay attention to the basics that he is demonstrating here. Reagan is speaking in basics, as all the great ones do.